So, good evening, everyone. So, this will be our lesson 1 for our subject assessment in Learning 2. So, as a student, you have been through a lot of assessment, right? So, for example, your midterm examinations, your final examinations, and most of which, if not all, you did not welcome. So, you don't like it. So, if you only had a choice, you would not subject yourself to the assessment process, right? So, one popular bargain of the students as their teacher is no more test, mom. So, this writer had students who would bargain no more test, or if it was not possible to forego the test, the request would go this way: please give a test which we can answer even without studying. So, this just proved that several students have a negative attitude toward assessment. So, our topic for today dwells on assessment as an integral part of teaching learning. So, hopefully, it will change your view and attitude of assessment. So, assessment in the context of teaching learning. So, let's first discuss the diagnostic assessment. So, when we say diagnostic assessment, this is a form of pre-assessment that allows teacher to determine individual students' prior knowledge, including misconceptions before instruction. So, our key term here is prior knowledge and before instruction. So in short, it is a primarily used to diagnose what students already know and don't yet know in order to guide instruction. So the results of diagnostic assessment also provide a basis for comparison to determine how much learning has taken place after the learning activity is completed. So this is usually done by giving a diagnostic pretest. Next is we have formative assessment. So when we say formative assessment, this takes place during instruction. So just like diagnostic, this is done prior knowledge. When we say formative, this takes place during instruction to provide the teacher with information regarding how well the learning objectives of a given learning activity are being met. So in formative assessment, teacher monitors student learning to get ongoing feedback to improve their teaching and for students to improve their learning. So in formative assessment, students are helped to identify the strengths and weaknesses and target areas that need to work. So I want you to take note that in formative assessment, we tend to identify the strength and the weaknesses of the learners. So likewise, teachers are also helped to recognize where students are struggling and so address problems immediately. So it is evidence-based improvement of ongoing teaching learning. So it is not sound to assess learning only at the end of the unit. So many teacher has presumed everything is clear to students only to get frustrated at the end of the unit that a lot of things were not understood. So it is like proceeding to XYZ when ABC were not yet mastered. So it is not only frustrating but also a waste of teaching learning time and effort. So a formative assessment is referred to as assessment for learning. Why? Because it is meant to ensure that learning takes place. Again, formative assessment is referred to assessment for learning because it is meant to ensure that learning takes place. So in the process of instruction, the teacher checks on students' learning. If the student discovers that the concepts and skills are not yet mastered, right there and then, the teacher reteaches to ensure the learning. So the phrase assessment for learning. So how do teachers do formative assessment? So teacher can determine students' level of understanding while teaching by asking students questions. So teacher can determine students' level of understanding while teaching by asking students questions. So second one is a better way to check on students' level of understanding, however, is to find out if indeed they understood the lesson by asking them questions or using other ways. So, for example, a usual question the teachers ask to find out if their students can follow the lesson is, did you understand? Or the students usually responds in a course, yes, ma'am, or yes, sir. So, here, a better way to check on students' level of understanding is to find out if they understood. So let us now proceed to the next topic, which is the summative assessment. So when we say summative assessment, this is used to evaluate student learning at the end of a defined instructional period. As you can see here, when we say formative assessment, this takes place during instruction. While when we are talking about summative, this takes place at the end of the instructional period. So while formative assessment, it is referred to for learning, assessment for learning. The summative assessment referred to assessment of learning. So it is assessment of learning because at the end of a project, unit, course, semester, program, or school year, or after diagnostic assessment, teaching, and formative assessment are done. So it is a picture of how much learning took place and to what extent the learning, the chapter, the unit, or course outcomes were attained. So the results of a summative assessment are the basis for grades and report to parents. So the summative assessment are done through the paper and pencil test and non-paper and pencil test. So you have learned how to construct paper and pencil test for one semester in the first course on assessment. So in this course on assessment, you will learn how to construct non-paper and pencil test. So you will have more lengthy discussion on the non-paper and pencil test when we reach the chapter 4. So let us now proceed to the traditional assessment and the authentic assessment. So I made here a figure for better understanding of the traditional assessment. So the traditional assessment includes the paper and pencil test. So when we say traditional assessment, this includes the paper and pencil test. So the paper and pencil tests are either selected response type or constructed response type. So this was the focus of the assessment of Learning 1 as you recall to your previous lesson. So I have here an example of the traditional assessment under the selective response type. So what are the examples of selected response type? So we have what we call the alternate response. So these are the questions or the type of assessment in which you answer true or false, yes or no, or check or cross or X. So another selected response type is the multiple choice and the matching type. On the constructed response type, we have the short answer, we have the essay, and we have the problem solving. So after the traditional assessment, we have the authentic assessment. So the term authentic assessment was coined by Grant Wiggins during the 1993 and leading proponent of reform in testing. So the assessment is termed authentic because students' knowledge and skills are assessed in the context that approximates that the real world or the real life as closely as possible. So the assessment requires student performance that models realistic encounters in life in contrast to taking a written test or writing an essay. So unlike the traditional assessment, you have to take exams, the paper and pencil, while on authentic assessment, it is related to a real world or a real life type of exam. So that is why the authentic assessment is likewise called performance assessment. So the authentic assessment is also known as the non-traditional assessment and alternative assessment. So it is referred to as alternative assessment because it offers students more choices than just taking a paper pencil test. So like multiple choice or an essay. So the word alternative implies that there is another way of assessing learning other than the traditional or the paper and pencil test that we have been used to. So the authentic assessment can be in the form of students' performance to display skills learned, the mastery of a process or procedure, or in the form of a product or a concrete output. So some examples of performance are student is able to dance tango, to dribble the ball, to send an email, to give a report in class using PowerPoint, or to set up an experiment, to lobby at the municipal council. So the authentic assessment can be done also by assessing the product of students' learning, so such as haiku, so composed a pair of pans of sewn, a videotape interview, or a capstone project. For usually, this is done by the IT students. So through capstone projects, students explore issues they are passionate about and work toward finding solutions to problems. So after the authentic and the traditional assessment, let's proceed to the norm and criterion reference assessment. So first, let's discuss about the criterion reference assessment. So in criterion reference assessment, we compare students' performance against a criterion or success which is predetermined standard. So with criterion reference test, so each student's performance is compared directly to the standard without considering how other students perform in the assessment. So the criterion reference assessment often use cut scores to place students into categories such as basic, proficient, and advanced. So, for example, the teacher's intended learning outcome is to spell at least 18 out of 20 words correctly. So, student A is able to spell 20 words correctly, student B 18 words, and student C 10 words. So, it is obvious that only student A and B were able to realize the predetermined standard as stated in the intended learning outcome, which is spell at least 18 out of 20 words correctly. So the performance or the score of each student is compared against a standard set by the teacher. So it is not compared against the performance of the other students. While when we are talking about norm reference assessment, we compare students' performance with the performance of other students. So the norm group not against the predetermined standard. So the composition of the norm group depends on the assessment. So for example, is comparing the performance of 7th graders in reading in a particular school system in the performance of a nationwide group of 7th graders in reading. So in a norm reference course, these are generally reported as percentile rank. So, for example, in the National College Entrance Examination or the NCEE, if you are familiar, which is conducted here in our country. So, a student who got the 99th percentile rank in the NCEE means that he belonged to the upper 1% and surpassed 99% of the NCEE examinees. So, a high school student graduate who got a 75th percentile rank means he belonged to the upper 25th and was above 75th% of the examinees. So the meaning of a norm reference score is derived from a comparison of students' score against other students' scores. So while the meaning of the criterion reference score is derived from comparing students' scores with established criterion of success. So the norm reference score will not tell you whether a student met, succeeded, or fell short of the standard of proficiency. So it is the criterion reference score that will tell you whether or not a student met the established standard of success or proficiency. So let us now differentiate the contextualized and the contextualized assessment. So when we say contextualized assessment, the focus is on the student's construction of functioning knowledge. So it is the student's performance in their application of knowledge and skills in the real work context of the discipline area. So contextualized assessment makes use of the performance-based tasks which are authentic in nature. So they reflect real life as we define authentic in our previous lesson. So for example, outside of the classroom. So we will identify tasks or the skills that required outside the classroom that require also students to utilize higher order thinking skills. So, students may have mastered the rules of, for example, the subject-verb agreement, gets a perfect score in multiple choice test on a subject-verb agreement, but when he/she delivers a speech in a real life, fails to observe the subject-verb agreement rules. So, let's proceed to the contextualized assessment. So, when we say the contextualized assessment, this includes the written exams, which are suitable for assessing declarative knowledge and do not necessarily have a direct connection to a real life context, unlike the contextualized assessment. So it focuses on declarative knowledge and procedural knowledge in artificial situations detached from the real work context. So both contextualized and decontextualized assessment or learning and assessment have their role in evaluating learning outcomes. So, in the practice of Briggs or the Tang, they claim that the decontextualized assessment has been overemphasized compared to the place declarative knowledge has in the curriculum. So both declarative knowledge and real-life application of that knowledge must be assessed appropriately. So a common mistake is to assess only the lead in declarative knowledge and not the functional knowledge that emerges from it. So let's now discuss about on how to establish high quality assessment. So number one, the quality assessments are in accordance with contemporary view of active learning and motivation. So there is a message that defines this number one um, ways. So this means that the learners discover and construct meaning, set plan, and work to realize their goals, associate and link new information with existing knowledge in meaningful ways, think critically and creatively, and etc. So the message is clear. So high quality assessment involve learners in the assessment process beginning with the setting of goals, monitoring of their own learning, and in building self-confidence because learners are intrinsically motivated to learn. So high quality assessment are not just a meaningless reproduction of knowledge learned by linking information to other bits of information. So meaningfully while thinking critically and creatively to apply what they learn to a real world situation. So in short, high quality assessment are contextualized and decontextualized. Number two is assessment of high quality is valid. So assessment is valid if it measures what is supposed to measure. So for example, how well the learning outcomes have been attained. So a teacher must be true to his or her intended learning outcomes. So the idea of the alignment of intended learning outcomes, teaching learning activities, and assessment is what Biggs called constructive alignment. So the essence of the outcome-based education. Next is number 3, assessment of high quality is reliable. So assessment is reliable when the test produces consistent scores. Consistent scores. So if you give a retest in math and find out that those who get high scores in the first take also get high score in the second take of the same test, and those who got low scores in the first take also get the low scores in the retest of the same test, then we can conclude that the assessment is reliable. If the opposite happens, such that those who scored, for example, high in the first take got low scores in the retest, and that those who got low in the first take scored high in the retake, then the assessment is not reliable. So it should be consistent. Number 4 is assessment of high quality is fair. It is fair if the assessment, or if it assess what it is supposed to be assessed, as stated in the learning outcomes, which is expected to have been taught. So this is the principle of deconstructive alignment in action. So obviously, assessing learners on something they have not been taught is unfair. So assessment is also unfair if it is biased against subgroup of the students. So for example, when negative stereotypes of particular subgroups are included in the test. So an example is when the test item portrays males in high-paying and prestigious jobs and females in low-paying and less prestigious jobs. So second example is when assessment unfairly penalizes a student based on student's ethnicity, for example, socioeconomic status, gender, religion, or disability. So, for example, when a teacher decides to see how well students can collaboratively solve problems, which requires students to work together synchronously online, where only affluent students who can afford to have laptops and internet connectivity can participate, while students from the lower economic status will be deprived of the collaborative program solving. So let us now go to the current trends in assessment by SANTROK. So number 1 is using at least some performance-based assessment. So this means that the use of objective tests such as alternate response, the multiple choice, and matching type is no longer adequate. So according to Carol, the president of the Association of the American Colleges and Universities, employers say our world is not a multiple choice world. So don't send us graduates who only know how to solve multiple choice problems. So instead, Snyder continues, employers are asking for what educators call a modern liberal education, more big picture thinking but with more real world application. So this does not mean that we have to set aside the use of objective tests in assessment, not at all. So objective tests, so for example, traditional assessment complement performance-based assessment, but the use of objectives alone won't suffice. Second one is examining higher level cognitive skills and emphasizing integrated rather than isolated skills. So these higher level cognitive skills include problem solving, critical thinking, decision making, drawing of inferences, is strategic thinking. So that is why it is not enough to make use of objective tests that assess simple recall. The third one is using multiple assessment methods. So to assess students, a current trend is to use multiple methods. So from multiple choice tests to essay, an interview, a project, a portfolio to self-evaluation, again, it is emphasized that we have not to do away with objective tests that measure simple recall. So these tests that require simple recall complement authentic assessment tools. Fourth one is having high performance standards, including the world-class standards for interpreting assessment results. So let us set standards high. So research says one's level of performance is lower than one's level of aspiration. So it is therefore sound to challenge students to meet high performance standards. The fifth one is involving students in all aspects of assessment. So it works if the students are involved from the setting of expected targets to be demonstrated after the instruction, to checking on their progress in the course of the teaching learning process, and to finally determine the extent to which they realize expected targets. Next is making standards and criteria public rather than private and secretive. So the evaluative criteria, so such as rubrics, are presented and explained at the beginning. So models of excellence aligned to the criteria are shown to provide a clear picture of a desired performance. So this may eliminate students' fear or unwelcoming attitude toward assessment. So lastly, using computers as part of assessment. So with computers, a bank of questions can be created which makes it possible for each student to be presented with different questions but are of equivalent standard. With computerized marking, immediate feedback may be given to students. So recording of assessment results and their statistical analysis are likewise facilitated with computers. So that's it for today's discussion. So I hope you learned something. So if you have any questions, you can ask it or chat it in our official group chat in our messenger. So make sure to finish this video because the next presentation will be your quiz. So this is your quiz. So this is the general direction. So answer the question and write your answer in the comment section following the given format. So this is worth 50 points. So the comment section is below our video, recorded video. So this is the format, sample format. So you have to write your name first, make sure it is complete, your block and your cluster, and then your answer. So this is the first question. Can diagnostic assessment and formative assessment affect the result of summative assessment, and how? Second question is, can teachers do away with traditional assessment, and explain your answer? So there is no time limit. You can answer any time within the night. So I will only accept your answer until 12 midnight. So 12:01 will not be accepted anymore. So again, your answers will be right or put in the comment section below. So again, this is the format and this is the question. So thank you very much. Have a good night, everyone.